This is the most twisted and evil story you will hear today. Close your eyes and imagine it. In the dim glow of the oil lamp, a man's lifeless body lay sprawled across the room, his lips stained with an unnatural blue color. Zola Madu stood over him, her face blank, yet her eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. A faint whisper escaped her lips. Another soul to the shadows. The faint sound of footsteps echoed outside, and Zola's pulse quickened. She had little time to clean up the mess, but that didn't matter. Zola was a professional at this, and before long, she had everything arranged. And the story she told everyone was that her dear, loving husband had suddenly slumped and died, possibly from a heart attack. As she sat down in her living room later that night, surrounded by a few sympathizers, Zola thought to herself, I give happiness and then I take life. Those that succumb to my charm deserve everything they get. They come to me desperate, like hypnotized fools, enchanted by my deadly charm. I pity those idiots, she says under her breath, as if speaking to an audience, because anyone who falls for me will soon get bitten and die. This is Zola Madu, possibly the world's most deadly Black Widow serial killer to date. The term Black Widow is given to a woman who kills her partner or husband, just like the female Black Widow spider may kill its partner. Those female spiders sometimes engage in what's called sexual cannibalism, meaning they sometimes kill and eat the male they've just mated with. In Zola's case, we must use the plural, partners and husbands. How many men did she kill? Well, we'll get around to that soon. Over a decade, Zola racked up around 100 million naira from the men she killed, making her certainly the richest Black Widow. She made men fall for her, and she was a genius when it came to that. She chose her men carefully. She would usually go for older, wealthy men who had no children or whose children were far away. She would seduce him and get him to marry her. And before she killed her man, she would make him change his will, stating that everything he owned would go to her. But how did all this start? What motivated Zola to kill the men she claimed to love? Zola was born on June 28, 1964. She grew up in a middle-class family and got all the things she needed when she was a child. As she neared her late teens, she wanted to pursue a career and before that, gain a higher education. However, her father clung to old-fashioned values and told her that she must forget about education and find a good man to settle down with. Zola dutifully followed her father's advice, except her idea of settling down was perhaps not what her father had envisioned. Her relationships never seemed to last very long, and over the years, she had serious relationships with more than 14 different men, and many of them died a mysterious death. Zola would support herself in between relationships with a job as a bank teller, which I guess is fitting for a woman who would spend the rest of her life taking other men's money. Her first husband was a man called Charles. He was the man of her dreams, or so it seemed. And finally, they settled down together. They also had 2 children together, and to all who knew her, she was living a very ordinary life. But that was far from the truth, though. She had a bloody plan in mind. Her husband, Charles, worked in the fabric printing industry. And in that industry, there's something called potassium cyanide. It's a colorless, poisonous, sugar-like substance used for dyeing and printing. This poisonous substance would come in handy for this evil Black Widow. Note that death from cyanide poisoning can look like death from a heart attack or other natural causes, and the victim can be dead in a matter of seconds. One day, her husband Charles was taken into the hospital, having suffered from a heart attack. Or at least that's what it looked like. After seeing a doctor, he was soon deemed to be in a fit state and told to go home. The heart attack had been minor, he was told. He was lucky. Sadly, after checking out of the hospital, he wouldn't make it through the night. Zola made sure she completed the job. After her husband's death, Zola took over the business, but over a period of 3 years, she ran it into the ground. It was not surprising since business was not her strong point. With the business destroyed, Zola was broke and down on her luck. But just a year after her business failure, a silver lining formed around the clouds above her head when she met a 66-year-old man who worked as a pharmaceutical wholesaler. That was Chief Obinna. The unfortunate man had met Zola at a birthday party and he was stricken by her looks. Zola's charm was her weapon. Her smile is disarming. Her touch is intoxicating. "You're a fascinating woman, Zola," Chief Obinna had said, his eyes lingering too long. "And you're a man who enjoys life's finer things," she replied, her voice dripping with honey. Within weeks, Zola had him wrapped around her little finger, and soon they were married. But the union would be short-lived. Their relationship lasted around 3 years, and then the love-struck gentleman died suddenly from what was thought to be a stroke, another type of death that cyanide poisoning can mimic. After a brief period of mourning, Zola set her sights on her next victim. This time, it was Ezekiel, a widower with a fortune in gold. She knew him before and met him again at a friend's wedding. He had recently been widowed. She approached him with calculated grace, her smile as sweet as ever. "Ezekiel, a man like you shouldn't face life alone," she said, her voice a gentle caress. "And a woman like you deserves happiness," he replied, his eyes softening. Their courtship was swift, and soon Ezekiel invited Zola to his estate. She worked her charm on him, getting him to transfer his estate to her, and she was successful. One evening, Zola prepared a lavish feast for Ezekiel: jollof rice, spiced to perfection, fried plantains, and a bottle of palm wine. She watched him eat, her heart pounding as he enjoyed each bite. But unknown to him, hidden in the stew was a carefully measured dose of cyanide. Ezekiel's laughter filled the room as he recounted tales of his business triumphs. But soon, his voice faltered, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hand clutched his chest. "Zola," he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "It's just the wine, my dear," she cooed, watching as his body convulsed. Moments later, he was still. Zola's face remained serene as she dragged his body into the adjoining room. She arranged the scene to mimic a natural death, ensuring no suspicion would fall on her. But as she turned to leave, a sudden chill enveloped the room. She felt an icy breath on her neck and spun around, heart racing. When she turned to look at Ezekiel's corpse, she felt his eyes staring at her intently. She quickly left the room. Another man had fallen to her poison. To those who knew Zola, it was starting to look like she had some pretty bad fortune when it came to husbands. At least, they thought, she inherited fortunes when her beloved passed away. The problem, however, was whenever she got hold of her lover's cash, she squandered it, making bad decisions on stocks and investments. Zola usually mourned her loss in public, but in her mind, as soon as she loses one husband, she begins cooking up a plan to meet another mogul. And there was no shortage of wealthy, old, lonely men. Her modus operandi never changed. So after the loss of her last husband, she soon met another ideal man, a 70-year-old chief named Michael. He had lost his wife some years ago and all his children were abroad. He was perfect. Zola ensured that their paths crossed, and when he met her, he was smitten with her, obsessed with her sultry charms and her way of making him feel wanted and secure. Of course, Zola was sweet to him and soon warmed herself into his bed, his bank account, and his will. And just like her previous relationships, this one didn't last very long either. Chief Michael suddenly dropped dead one day from a heart attack just 3 months into their marriage. I don't need to tell you by now that he didn't die of an actual heart attack. A year later, she met the wonderful Mr. Ejike, another stinkingly rich elderly man who also ticked all the boxes for Zola. The two got engaged after 6 months, and just as love was blossoming, he died one cool evening after having dinner with his dear wife. The death certificate said he died from a heart attack. Now, I must tell you that the police and the media don't exactly know just how many men Zola dated or killed throughout her life. But what was becoming quite apparent was the fact that this woman had something of the Medusa touch in her. That fact didn't escape the media, and soon people started talking. The children of her last husband, who lived far away in another country, arrived to challenge her regarding their father's will. And before you know it, Zola started receiving some unwanted publicity. The children from this late husband insisted that Zola be arrested and that their father's body be exhumed for an autopsy. Zola did not want that at all, and as his lawfully wedded wife, she fought that injunction fiercely. But sadly for her, it was during this time that a lot of media people started reaching out to her to say her own side of the story. Unfortunately for her, as more people started talking about her story, distant family members of her former husbands and partners also started speaking up. And before long, there were many family members comparing notes on how her previous husbands had died. When Zola was asked if she thought it strange that so many of her lovers and husbands gave up the ghost so soon after meeting her, she replied saying, "These men had a strong desire to marry me. How can you blame me if they died?" On the request of the children of one of her former husbands, who won the case to have their father's body exhumed, her deceased husband's body was finally exhumed, and the autopsy soon revealed that cyanide was found in his blood. Now, things started to make sense. Zola was finally officially arrested and charged. The police got a search warrant and they found traces of cyanide in her home. They also discovered medical books that contained advice relating to poisoning and the administration of drugs. But even more damning, they found a diary where she wrote about her plans to murder her last 3 husbands. That evidence was very damning. Her trial lasted 6 months, and hundreds of people stormed the courtroom every single day. Zola was eventually convicted of 3 counts of murders. But as you see from this story, it's likely she killed a lot more people, perhaps as many as 10 husbands and lovers. During the trial, Zola was asked by a journalist, "But didn't you feel fear when you killed those people?" With an angered expression painted across her face, she replied, "You are mad to ask me such a question." At first, she refused to say anything at all in court, but the evidence was conclusive. In the end, she admitted to killing her last husband, telling the court that he was being domestically abusive to her. She admitted to hating her last husband, although she didn't comment on the other men she had been accused of killing. She was sentenced to death by hanging. And when the verdict was given, she told the court that she would die smiling. She then said, "Please hang me." Later, she withdrew her statements, and her lawyers argued that she had dementia and didn't know what she was saying. The court didn't buy that. As you watch this, the Black Widow's home is an isolated prison cell in a maximum prison awaiting her death by hanging. What a sad story. Please note that this story is fiction and any resemblance to any real person is unintentional. However, there are two critical moral lessons in this story. Greed leads to destruction, and deception cannot hide forever. If you liked this story, go ahead and press the like button and let me know where you are watching from. And if you have ideas for any stories you would like me to tell, also leave it in the comments. Thank you and God bless you.